Chapter 1 of Operation Terror by Murray Leinster. Read by Mark Nelson. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Operation Terror, Chapter 1. On the morning the radar reported something odd out in space, Lockley awoke at about 20 minutes to 8. That was usual. He'd slept in a sleeping bag on a mountain flank with other mountains all around. That was not unprecedented. He was there to make a baseline measurement for a detailed map of the Boulder Lake National Park, whose facilities were now being built. Measuring a baseline, even with the newest of electronic apparatus, was more or less a commonplace job for Lockley. This morning, though, he woke and realized gloomily that he dreamed about Jill Holmes again, which was becoming a habit he ought to break. He'd only met her 4 times, and she was going to marry somebody else. He had to stop. He stirred, preparatory to getting up. At the same moment, certain things were happening in places far away from him. As yet, no unusual object in space had been observed. That would come later. But far away up at the Alaska radar complex, a man on duty watch was relieved by another. The relief man took over the monitoring of the giant, football field-sized radar antenna that recorded its detections on magnetic tape. It happened that on this particular morning only one other radar watched the skies along a long stretch of the Pacific coast. There was the Alaskan installation, and the other was in Oregon. It was extremely unusual for only those 2 to be operating. The people who knew about it, or most of them, thought that official orders had somehow gone astray. Where the orders were issued, nothing out of the ordinary appeared. All was normal, for example, in the Military Information Center in Denver. The survey saw nothing unusual in Lockley's being at his post, and other men at places corresponding to his in the area which was to become Boulder Lake National Park. It also seemed perfectly natural that there should be bulldozer operators, surveyors, steel workers, concrete men, and so on, all comfortably at breakfast in the construction camp for the project. Everything seemed normal everywhere. Up to the time the Alaskan installation reported something strange in space, the state of things generally was neither alarming nor consoling. But at 8:02 a.m. Pacific time, the situation changed. At that time, Alaska reported an unscheduled celestial object of considerable size, high out of atmosphere and moving with surprising slowness for a body in space. Its course was parabolic, and it would probably land somewhere in South Dakota. It might be a bolide, a large, slow-moving meteorite. It wasn't likely, but the entire report was improbable. The message reached the Military Information Center in Denver at 8:05 a.m. By 8:06, it had been relayed to Washington, and every plane on the Pacific coast was ordered aloft. The Oregon radar unit reported the same object at 8:07 a.m. It said the object was 750 miles high, 400 miles out at sea, and was headed toward the Oregon coastline, moving northwest to southeast. There was no major city in its line of travel. The impact point computed by the Oregon station was nowhere near South Dakota. As other computations followed other observations, a second place of fall was calculated, then a third. Then the Oregon radar unbelievably reported that the object was decelerating. Allowing for deceleration, 3 successive predictions of its landing point agreed. The object, said these calculations, would come to Earth somewhere near Boulder Lake, Colorado, in what was to become a national park. Impact time should be approximately 8:14 a.m. These events followed Lockley's awakening in the wilds, but he knew nothing of any of them. He himself wasn't near the lake, which was to be the center of a vacation facility for people who liked the outdoors. The lake was almost circular and was a deep, rich blue. It occupied what had been the crater of a volcano millions of years ago. Already bulldozers had plowed out roads to it through the forest. Men worked with graders and concrete mixers on highways and on bridges across small rushing streams. There was a camp for them. A lakeside hotel had been designed, and stakes were driven in the ground where its foundation would eventually be poured. There were infant big-mouthed bass in the lake and fingerling trout in many of the streams. A huge wildlife control trailer truck went grumbling about such trails as were practical, attending to these matters. Yesterday, Lockley had seen it gleaming in bright sunshine as it moved toward Boulder Lake on the highway nearest to the station. But that was yesterday. This morning he awoke under a pale gray sky. There was complete cloud cover overhead. He smelled conifers and woods mold and mountain stone in the morning. He heard the faint sound of tree branches moving in the wind. He noted the cloud cover. The clouds were high, though. The air at ground level was perfectly transparent. He turned his head and saw a prospect that made being in the wilderness seem entirely reasonable and satisfying. Mountains reared up in every direction. A valley lay some thousands of feet below him, and beyond it other valleys, and somewhere a stream rushed white water to an unknown destination. Not many waked to such a scene. Lockley regarded it, but without full attention. He was preoccupied with thoughts of Jill Holmes, and unfortunately she was engaged to Mary Vale, who was also working in the park some 30 miles to the northeast, near Boulder Lake itself. Lockley didn't know him well, since he was new in the survey. He was up there to the northeast with an electronic survey instrument like Lockley's, and on the same job. Jill had an assignment from some magazine or other to write an article on how national parks are born, and she was staying at the construction camp to gather material. She'd learned something from Vale, and much from the engineers, while Lockley had tried to think of interesting facts himself. He'd failed. When he thought about her, he thought about the fact that she was engaged to Vale. That was an unhappy thought. Then he tried to stop thinking about her altogether, but his mind somehow lingered on the subject. At 10 minutes to 8, Lockley began to dress, wilderness fashion. He began by putting on his hat. It had lain on the pile of garments by his bed. Then he donned the rest of his garments in the exact reverse of the order in which he'd removed them. At 8 o'clock he had a small fire going. He had no premonition that anything out of the ordinary was going to happen that day. This was still before the first Alaskan report. At 8:10 he had bacon sizzling and a small coffee pot almost enveloped by the flames. Events occurred, and he knew nothing at all about them. For example, the Military Information Center had been warned of what was later privately called Operation Terror, while Lockley was still tranquilly cooking breakfast and thinking, frowning a little, about Jill. Naturally, he knew nothing of emergency orders sending all planes aloft. He wasn't informed about something reported in space and apparently headed for an impact point at Boulder Lake. As the computed impact time arrived, Lockley obliviously dumped coffee into his tin coffee pot and put it back on the flames. At 8:13 instead of 8:14, this information is from the tape records, there was an extremely small earth shock recorded by the Berkeley, California seismograph. It was a very minor shock, about the intensity of the explosion of 100 tons of high explosive a very long distance away, and barely strong enough to record its location, which was Boulder Lake. The cause of that explosion, or shock, was not observed visually. There had been no time to alert observers, and in any case the object should have been out of atmosphere until the last few seconds of its fall, and where it was reported to fall the cloud cover was unbroken, so nobody reported seeing it. Not at once, anyhow, and then only one man. Lockley did not feel the impact. He was drinking a cup